What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here to talk to you about a novel, The Road to Avalon by Joan Wolfe. I have been kind of on a King Arthur kick lately. I'm always a fan of King Arthur, but I've read a few King Arthur books lately, and this is probably my favorite one that I have read. Definitely of some of the ones I've read recently, this is one that I like the most. What I like about this book is that it takes all of these things that are common to most King Arthur stories, and it puts them in a slightly different context. The basic plot of this book more or less follows the events that you are familiar with if you are familiar with King Arthur stories. Uther and Igraine, they get married, they have a kid, but the kid is fostered with another family, and then he becomes the High King when he's 15 or 16, and then the Round Table forms. He has an illegitimate son with his sister, and then there's a civil war that breaks out that kind of creates the fall of the kingdom. All of these things, you are familiar with them from other King Arthur stories, but it takes these events and it has them, for lack of a better word, it makes sense when these things happen because I feel like these characters feel very real and organic. It's not like, well, this is something that happens in the King Arthur lore, so it has to happen in this story. Most of the time, the things that I recognize here from other King Arthur stories, they make sense based on what we know about these characters. Once in a blue moon, there will be something where I'm like, hey, why did this happen? Why did this character do that? But I was really impressed with this book, being able to traverse this well-known path that all of these other King Arthur stories have taken, but it makes me feel like, oh, okay, you're going to do that thing, and you're doing it in this way. Okay, I didn't think you were going to do that, and now that I see that what you're doing, okay, I understand that. That makes a lot of sense. There are a couple of examples that don't quite work, spoilers, but this story ends with King Arthur dying, and at the end, Mordred is basically tricked into starting a civil war against his father while his father is fighting a war overseas, and Mordred does not want to do it. Mordred is not a bad guy in this book. A lot of times, Mordred is much more villainous, and he is very much wanting to go to war against his father, but here, he's being tricked by the guy that he thinks is his older brother, who kind of wants to manipulate him and eventually take the throne for himself. And then at the end, the war is over, and then Mordred, he was told multiple times, you need to go to France. You need to go way away from here, and then when all of this is settled, then you can come back, and Arthur will make everything right, and you won't be hated. Everyone thinks that you are starting the Civil War right now. I know the truth. Once all of this is done, then I will summon you. And Mordred says, what if I did the opposite of that? So he stays and watches most of the fight, and then when the fighting is all over, then he runs out with his sword brandished, and he's like, hey, I want to talk to my dad, and someone sees him and thinks that he is trying to make a play to kill the king, and so they throw a spear at him, and then Arthur sees it and jumps in the line of fire. And it feels like the last, 5 pages of the book, it feels like Joan Wolfe was saying, well, I have to kill off King Arthur, how do I do it? So suddenly Mordred is holding the idiot ball in this book when, even though he was quite naive and he didn't always make decisions that made sense, and Arthur would kind of point out, like, you need to act more like a king. You need to, use your head a little bit more. Even though he wasn't always the smartest character in the books, this felt especially stupid of him. Also, as Arthur is dying, he says, I want to name Constantine, son of Cawdor, I want to name him as my heir. And that came completely out of nowhere, because I don't even think that Constantine has any lines in this book. Cawdor has a little bit more presence in the book than Constantine, and that's one of those things that is part of the King Arthur lore. Traditionally, Arthur and Mordred kill each other in civil war, and then Constantine becomes the next king of the High King of Britain, because much earlier in Arthur's reign, Arthur had named Constantine's father, Cawdor, who was a distant cousin, had named him as the heir. Basically, if something happens to me and I don't have any kids, you will be the next king. And then if I do have kids, then you won't be. And then Arthur never did have any kids that he recognized as his heir. And then by that point, Cawdor's son, Constantine, takes the throne. That's normally how it happens. But here, Mordred doesn't die. Mordred is taken to France, but then Arthur tells his friends Kay and Bedivere, I want Constantine to become the next king. That's a little weird. It kind of comes out of nowhere, especially since Constantine, I'm pretty sure, doesn't have any dialogue in this book. There are a couple of moments like that. I won't go into every one of them. At one point, Guinevere, in this book, her name is spelled Gwynethar. It's more of a Welsh spelling of her name, and Bedivere, it's Bedivere. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, but I traditionally call these characters Guinevere and Bedivere. But anyway, in this, those names are spelled with a little bit more of their Welsh flavor. But Guinevere, she is like 99.9% sure that she is barren. She has been sleeping with Arthur and Bedivere for years, and then when she receives the news that Arthur and Bedivere died in the war, this is a false report created by Agravain so that he can eventually take the throne. Whenever she hears this news, then Agravain kind of encourages Mordred, hey, you should marry Guinevere, because you're next in line to take the throne, so you should marry her and take her as your wife. And Mordred has always had a crush on Guinevere, and so he suggests this, and then shockingly, he is able to convince Guinevere that this is a good idea. And this is another one of those things that happened in one of the old stories from like over 1,000 years ago, where Mordred basically starts a rumor that King Arthur is dead whenever he's off fighting in Rome, and then he takes the throne for himself and then takes Guinevere as his wife. Depending on your interpretation of the story, maybe she's into it or maybe she wasn't, but in this story, she is into it. He says, you should be my wife, and she says, that's probably not a good idea because I'm barren. I will not be able to give you any sons. And he says, I think you could give me a son. Really, really weird. Everyone knows that Arthur and Guinevere did not have any kids, and since Arthur did have a kid by his sister, and everybody knows that because as soon as Mordred shows up, everyone says, yeah, he looks exactly like Arthur. That's Arthur's son. So everyone knows Arthur is not the problem in him and Guinevere being unable to produce a child. And she has been having this secret affair with Bedivere for years, and she also hasn't had a kid by him, so she should know better by this point that she's not going to have any kids. And so Mordred's saying, I think that I'll be able to give you a kid. That won't be a problem. That was really weird. It doesn't end up going anywhere. This is just a reference to one of those things from the lore. But sometimes you'll have a weird little thing like that where it feels like the author wants to reference something from the lore, and then it doesn't quite fit with everything else that's going on. For example, Arthur naming Constantine as his heir, even though his son, who was very nearly the next High King, was still alive. And Arthur does have a couple of conversations with Bedivere and Guinevere, saying that Mordred, he's not quite got the makings of a king. He's a good boy, he's very nice and sweet, but he doesn't quite have that steel that is needed in a king. And if only there had been like another callback to that on Arthur's deathbed, where maybe Kay or Bedivere says, what about your son, Mordred? And he would say, no, he's not fit to be a king, it's just not going to work, this is for his own good just as much as it is for the rest of Britain. Something like that would have been a nice little conversation to have at the end. I have mentioned that Guinevere is having an affair with Bedivere. This book does not have Lancelot in it at all. Lancelot is a character who was created a couple of centuries after some of the other King Arthur characters were first getting popular. I don't know when each of the main King Arthur characters first appeared. I know that the very earliest mention of Arthur in a historical document, it was talking about someone else. I don't remember who it was, and then the document said he was pretty good, but he was no Arthur. And that was the earliest mention of Arthur, so maybe he was real, maybe he wasn't, we don't know. And then I believe in the Gododin Chronicle, It says Arthur and Mordred fought in the Valley of Camlin. We don't know if they fought each other. Were they fighting together? Did they die? Were they taken captive? We don't know. And then over the years, other characters would get added to the lore. But Lancelot, I believe, came quite a bit after Arthur, Guinevere, Mordred, Merlin. Bedivere originally was quite a bit more important than he would be in most stories nowadays. A lot of the characteristics of certain knights would get passed on to other knights. For example, in one of the older stories, Griflet is the one who takes Arthur's sword and throws it in the lake after he dies. And then later on, someone took that story and gave it to Bedivere instead. And likewise, Bedivere at one time was the one having an affair with Guinevere, and someone took that and gave it to Lancelot. This story feels like, and I haven't read any interviews or anything with Joan Wolfe where she was talking about her thought process on this, but it feels like she is trying to be as true to real-world history as she can, while also still writing a fictional story. Since we don't know if King Arthur was real, and most of these characters probably didn't exist, at least in the way that we think about them in King Arthur stories now, she is taking these characters and putting them in a realistic setting. There is almost no magic or any kind of fantasy elements in this. This is just a real-world historical drama featuring King Arthur, and it's not knights, it's soldiers. And it's not, there's no dragons or anything. They're just fighting in wars, and there's a lot of politics going on. And I like that quite a bit. My ideal version of King Arthur would be this, but with a little bit more magic. I don't think there's a problem with having magic in a King Arthur story. I also don't have a problem necessarily with demystifying or demysticalifying King Arthur or the Trojan War. I think that the movie Troy and the Clive Owen King Arthur movie, I think those are both very good, and they have taken out almost all of the mystical elements in those stories. But also, I think you can have the mystical elements and still have a good story. I'm getting a little off track, but this feels like she's very much trying to set this in real-world history and still keep to a lot of the same story beats that you are familiar with if you are pretty familiar with a lot of the big events from King Arthur's reign. And so here, Merlin, instead of being a court magician for Uther and later Arthur and being kind of an advisor to both of them, he is actually Igraine's father, Igraine being Arthur's mother. So Merlin is Arthur's grandfather, and also Merlin is the father of Morgause and Morgan, who are traditionally Arthur's sisters, or half-sisters, but here they are actually Igraine's half-sisters. And so this kind of plays with the Arthur and Morgan Le Fay thing a little bit. Most of the time, Morgan Le Fay is presented as a bad guy. This story, she is unequivocally a good guy. It doesn't really take her into being even a misunderstood villain. This kind of sort of does that with Mordred a little bit, but mostly he's being manipulated. But with Morgan, at no point here does she become the enemy of Arthur and Camelot. But basically, this kind of plays with the incest relationship between Arthur and Morgan, where they fell in love with each other because they didn't know that they were related. Merlin assumed that everyone at Avalon is not an island in this book. It's just basically like a big ranch that Merlin raised Arthur and Morgan at, and also his steward Ector and his son Kay. They also lived at this ranch. And anyway, Merlin was under the assumption that everyone thought that Arthur was his illegitimate son, and so he didn't think anything of Arthur and Morgan having a close relationship with each other. It wasn't until after he had told Arthur that he was the son of Uther that Arthur said, "By the way, I'd like to marry Morgan." And Merlin said, that's not possible because she's your aunt. And Arthur said, well, she's my half-aunt, so, maybe I could still marry her. And Merlin says, no, all the others, the Celtics, they would not stand for this. The church, they would not stand for it. But by this point, it's already too late. Morgan is already pregnant. And so this plays with that a little differently, but it still, like I said, it still hits a lot of those same story beats that you are familiar with. I have talked about this a lot longer than I thought I would. I liked this book quite a bit. I would highly recommend it if you can find it. I think, like I said, this is one of my favorite King Arthur books that I have read in recent memory. Definitely, I mean, I've read others like nonfiction books about the lore of King Arthur or collections of short stories, which are usually hit or miss. Some of them will be good, some of them will be bad. This is my favorite singular story about King Arthur. I like this quite a bit, with a few exceptions. There were a couple of things where I was like, that's a little weird, but more or less, I thought this was just a very solid effort. So those are my thoughts on The Road to Avalon. I hope you guys liked this video, and I will see you guys in the future with more videos. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.